At just 15 years old, our next guest made a commitment to dedicate her life to the promotion of African development. She's the holder of a PhD in African Development and Policy Studies from Howard University in DC. It's also coupled with a Master's in International Relations from the University of Warwick in Coventry, England. She's a researcher, a teacher, fiction and non-fiction writer, and a public intellectual. Her book, Before We Set Sail, is a historical fiction novel which was shortlisted out of 250 manuscripts from Africans around the world. However, her latest writings comes in during the commemoration of Burkina Faso's slain president, Thomas Sankara, who died on October 15, 1987. Dr. Chika Ezeanya joins us via Skype from Rwanda, Kigali, to speak to us about her work. Doctor, welcome to Sahara TV.
Thank you, Fungai. It's my pleasure.
Okay, so we agreed I'm going to call you Chika, but anyway. So, at 15 years old, an African girl, obviously somewhere in Africa, you decided to start dreaming about how Africans can transform Africa themselves. I mean, other girls at that age were probably dreaming about fashion, maybe even about boys. What made you make that decision to dedicate your life to working on this?
Thanks for the question. I'm not really sure what made me to do that, except I just remember that I cried for 2 or 3 days after reading Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And the pain was so real. And I just remember praying and saying, God, I just know that it's not, and I know you're not just happy that Africa is the way it is today. So I don't know if there's anything I can do, but I just really want to do something. It was a very frustrating prayer, but I just felt that, okay, whatever I
Did you have any personal experiences growing up about how Africa's conditions? Because at 15, you're mostly oblivious to a lot of things. You don't see if there's any you could pick maybe injustices here and there, but in terms of economics and how things are run, I probably don't know if you had managed to capture that or you got that from the book.
Well, I was at 15, I was in the first year in the university. I was already a first-year student in the university in Nigeria at the age of 15. So I wasn't that young in terms of experience.
Right.
Yes, so I had to read that book as part of the course requirements. So, and it opened my eyes. It just opened my eyes to so many things. And I started to see that something started the situation in Africa and that it's possible that it could be changed. And I just thought that if one person, and okay, I used to be in love with quotes. I had a book of quotes where I will read. Well, I also give a lot of credit to my father, who would buy newspapers every day, and then from reading cartoons as a child, I started to read the actual news and the stories. I remember I used to read Owe Lakemfa a lot on. Yes, I used to read him a lot because he would write on international issues. So, and I would write down the quotes. I think he would always start with quotes, and I think Penny Jason also. So I would just write the quotes. And I remember I came across, a couple of quotes saying that one person can make a difference, be the change you want to see in the world, and things like that. So I guess it was also a period of idealism. So where I just thought that, okay, yeah, if Martin Luther King said it, if Mahatma Gandhi said it, then I think I can make a difference. And that's just kind of how it started.
So obviously you were a very studious person as a girl. And now we fast forward to the present day work. I mean, you've also published a book. Can you just talk real quickly about that book before we touch the subject of Thomas Sankara?
Oh, thanks, Fungai. Before We Set Sail is about Olaudah Equiano. He was a slave who lived in the 18th century. The very first slave to write his own biography, his autobiography. And he was the richest African alive during his time.
Right.
And yes, and he fought for the liberation of other slaves. And I was reading his autobiography when I was doing my PhD, and he wrote just a couple of chapters on the time he spent in Africa as a slave. And he wrote the rest of the book on the time he spent in slavery in North America and in the UK. And it just wouldn't leave me after I read the book. I was wondering, why didn't he write so much about, because I knew he was first enslaved in Africa before he was shipped to North America.
Right.
And I thought to myself, why didn't he write a lot about the time he spent in Africa as a slave? It just bothered me because I had African American friends who would tell me that our grandfathers sold their own grandfathers into slavery,
Right.
and that kind of thing. I just felt that we needed to build a bridge, between Africa and African American, Africans and African Americans. That part of history ought to be clarified. And then I set out to write. I wanted to write really just real. I just wanted to write a textbook on slavery in Africa at that time. But I thought to myself, how many people will pick up a history textbook and read? Why don't you try something more interesting? And that was how the idea of a historical fiction came about. So it was actually, I did a lot of research. It was supposed to be factual history, but I had to flesh it out and make it a bit interesting by making it historical fiction.
Okay,
Yes.
that's good. It sounds like an interesting read, obviously. Now, Thomas Sankara, he died 1987. On the 15th of October, we actually just celebrated his anniversary this past week. Now, this was one great leader, at least he's known that way. And most of Africa has never seen a leader who matches that standard in terms of the greatness. And I'll talk about some of the things that he had actually done. He had cut on government spending. He was against corruption. He was against the hanging of self-portraits, obviously, in the office. He was always pro, self-sufficiency, always reminding the African people to do it themselves in terms of whatever they produced and did. Now, can you tell us briefly some of the stuff, and let's go into that subject. Why did you pick him, and what was your message behind that writing?
Okay, thank you, Fungai. Very interestingly, I heard of Thomas Sankara for the first time in 2010. And it's a shame because I considered myself a little bit, just tiny bit knowledgeable, when it comes to African history. And never heard about Thomas Sankara. So it was such a shock reading about him and all he did for his country and how he stood up to challenge the imperialism of his day. So I took a serious interest in his life and in what he achieved. And then 3 weeks ago, I had to be in Burkina Faso for a conference. And when I got there, one of the first things I did was to ask around, how do I get to Thomas Sankara's grave? And a very kind intellectual from Burkina Faso, who was also an attendant who also attended the conference, volunteered to take me to his grave. And while we were going there, I was shocked. It was almost as if we were going to a jungle. It was very bad. It was really bad, and it was a very emotional trip for me. And I could not just believe and reconcile the fact that this larger-than-life figure could be, buried so in such a very demeaning place. And I hasten to add that it has nothing to do with glorifying him in death, because he never sought that glory when he was alive. I'm sure he would have actually asked to be buried in an unmarked grave in the cheapest casket possible. So it has nothing to do with trying to impose some form of praise on him, but it's about the living. You go to the short documentary. I made it out of that visit to his grave. You see the burial place of Martin Luther King. You see Mahatma Gandhi's cremation site, and you see that there is a very big gap in Africa in terms of trying to celebrate heroes and trying to understand that there are people who did their best for this continent, who came out. And one thing is that in life, if you don't have a role model, if you don't have precedents, you think that the problem you have is just about you alone and that it's insurmountable. But when there are people you can look at and say that this person met this same problem and he tried his best to address it and he achieved so much, then it's possible that in this generation, there is also possible that someone like that can be raised who can try to address the problem and the challenges of today. But we don't have that in Africa. So there is a hopelessness in the system. There is a collective consciousness of pessimism among Africans because the people who have tried, who have given their best to change this continent are not being upheld as role models. And it has really made it difficult for people to really identify Africa and Africans with change and transformation. So that was the cry of my heart as I entered the site of Thomas Sankara's graveyard. He did so much, like you mentioned. I mean, we can't even talk about his achievements in the next couple of hours. There is no we can talk about what he achieved for Burkina Faso and for Africa. He did so well for the country and for the consciousness of the African. But who knows about him? I just got to know about him about 3 years ago, and I know it's the same with so many young people I have had the opportunity to interact with and to ask questions. So that is the burning issue at this time. Why is it that Africans are ignorant of those who have contributed so much to the development of this continent? What is wrong?
I think there's just before we had this interview, I was just checking some questions that other people might have, and some people had given comparisons between Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba, and somewhere in that conversation Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe came in. But now there's obviously certain levels that this discussion can be had without having to cross over too much and too deep to obscure the whole picture. But Thomas Sankara was one of those that would let his cabinet drive in a Renault. Back in the day, a Renault was a simple French vehicle, and he didn't want too much security. He was the guy who'd go jogging, and for argument's sake or for just the humor part of it, his waistline, according to your writing, had never exceeded what it normally should be. And he was somebody who liked to live cheaply. In fact, on his death, they found 450, I think he found like $400 on him, and he owned less property, a few bikes, I think. Now, fast forward to this day, we have people that are living large. They feel they need to have all this and then say that to the rest of Africa whilst people are starving and struggling. So he limited his expenditure on government. His salary was $450 a month. So we can go on and deep into it. But I think my question will be, what makes an African hero in your own, if I may ask, in your own voice?
Thank you, Fungai. I would say that what makes an African hero is not different from what makes a hero. A real hero is a selfless person, someone who rises up and looks around and says, I'm not going to continue this same degradation going on around me. The retrogression I am noticing and I can see around me, I will not be part of this anymore. I think there is something I can do. That's what makes a hero. It's all about selflessness. It's all about giving and giving and giving without expecting anything in return. And knowing that if it comes to paying the supreme price, that you will pay because you would rather be dead and buried than to be alive and keep witnessing the evil, if I may use that word, going on around you. So that's what makes a hero. And one of the last things he said before he died was that he knew, of course, he knew the conspiracy that was thickening around him. He was very much aware of it. He could actually see his death. And he said, I feel like a man on a bike, on a bicycle, riding a very steep hill. I can't stop. I can't, and I know there's a problem. There's something wrong. but there's nothing I can do. I can't stop. If I stop, I'll roll back. And of course, I just have to keep riding. He said that as much. And that's how it is. That's how a hero works. A hero is someone that says, I'm going to do this and I'm just going to do this.
I'm going to quote some of your writing. You said here in 1987, during a meeting of the African leaders under the auspices of the Organization of African Unity, Thomas Sankara tried to convince his peers to turn their backs on the debt-owed Western nations. According to him, debt is a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa. It is a reconquest that turns each one of us into a financial slave. He would not request for nor accept aid from the West. So some people would say that maybe the West conspired to have a hand into his death, and also the same with Patrice Lumumba, you know. And then today we have rhetoric of the same nature where Robert Mugabe talks about indigenization, taking back the mines, and then also reclaiming the land from the farmers who were obviously the former colonizers of the country. So do you think that maybe the West would also be involved in the dislike of that tone in his speech?
In terms of Mugabe?
In terms of Sankara, in terms of Mugabe, or anybody else who most probably would, you know, request that kind of stance against the West?
The truth is that in 2013, the realities are so different from 1987 when Thomas Sankara was assassinated. Mm-hmm. So, of course, in 1987, the West just happened to be the sole, if you may, imperial figure in Africa. Today, there are so many competing interests. The Chinese are there, the Indians are there. And I tell people one day the Eskimos will come to sell snow to us in Africa. Truth is this, I would not even, of course, when I started writing and when I read Walter Rodney, I was really so anti-Western and standing and writing. But these days I look inwards more. I tell myself, you say the West today, you say China, you say India, you can blame everybody for your challenges. What happens to you? So it is not a question of who. It's a question of what are we doing to stand up for ourselves as a people. So you blame the West today, then tomorrow you blame China, then you blame India, then who else will you blame after that? Africans should be able to know that the challenges we are facing as a people is just the same. The West we can blame the West today, we can blame anybody tomorrow. But if Africans can stand up and decide to build Africa based on what we have, based on who we are, then we'll gain the respect of the world. So it's not a question of blaming anybody. It's a question of now, 50 years and counting after colonialism ended, is a question of blaming Africans. And I think that's part of what we need to do in terms of getting to know our heroes. So when the colonial masters came and established formal education as we know it today, it was not in their interest for Africans to celebrate Africa's own heroes. It was in the interest of the colonial masters for Africans to celebrate the heroes of the colonial masters. That's why I was taught that Mungo Park discovered the Niger River. So what were my great-grandfathers doing around the Niger River? And Mungo Park had to travel all the way to come and discover it. So that's part of colonial education. But then, even in 2013, you go and look at the curriculum, it's still the same thing. There has hardly been any transformation in terms of changing the curriculum in Africa in order to reflect who we are as a people and what we represent. Let me give you an example. I co-authored a paper with an Indian colleague of mine, and we went to the libraries, the university libraries around some parts of Africa, and we saw very few textbooks authored by Africans in the libraries. And even when they are authored by Africans, they are most of the examples and case studies used are very foreign in nature. But then in India, you find that you are not really allowed to teach, solely relying on a foreign textbook. Right. So what you see happen is Indian professors co-author with American, top professors, Harvard University professors, in the Europe, in England, Oxford University professors, in order for them to use Indian examples, Indian case studies, use indigenous Indian knowledge to be able to build Indians up when they study. And that's just a very simple example of what is going on across the continent. So,
Right.
of course, he's doing what he can do, but what are we doing as individuals?
I guess, yeah. Now, anyway, we've run short of time. This is obviously an interesting and in-depth, actually, discussion that we could go on and on. But in the end, before we close, what is Pan-Africanism?
Pan-Africanism is the belief in Africa, and permit me to say sub-Saharan Africa. I will come under a lot of, if you make criticism for limiting it to sub-Saharan Africa, but I have my reasons, which, as you just mentioned, we don't have the time to delve into. But I will say it's a belief in the unity of the African race, and the fact that we face the same challenges and we need to address these challenges together. And that's why we need to stop seeing ethnic divisions. We need to stop seeing this person as this ethnic group, that person from that ethnic group. We need to see ourselves as human beings, Africans who are facing the same challenges, and we need to address the challenges we are facing as a people. That is Pan-Africanism.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Chika Ezeanya.
Thank you, Fungai.
I know you're sitting right there in Rwanda where ethnic cleansing obviously took place, and the speech falls right in place. But thank you very much. That was obviously Dr. Chika Ezeanya calling from Rwanda, Kigali, via Skype. And she's a teacher, researcher, and also a public intellectual. So if you can reach her, please go ahead. Thank you very much. We'll stay tuned because we have further programming coming along.
If you don't know where you come from, you will never find where you're going.
When Nigeria is working, we will all know.
PDP and us are diametrically opposed.
SaharaTV, TV, the best TV, information, education, inspiration. SaharaTV,
I am from SaharaTV. I'd like to ask you a few questions.
Information, education, inspiration.